Emerson knew that Thoreau had wanted to live by the pond. He had been thinking about it for some time, never had the opportunity to do so. So Emerson said, well, if you live on my property, I'll let you stay there, but you need to clear this land. So Thoreau said, great, I can grow beans there. So Emerson buys this land. It's his pride and joy. He says to his young friend, sure, if you want to move out there, that's great. Go ahead. I need you to improve the land. But of course, Thoreau had to cut down some of Emerson's white pines to build his house. So, but then there was an Irishman on the other side of the pond that had a shanty. They were leaving Concord, so Thoreau bought his shanty for $4.25 and then dismantled that and used it in the building of his house. So his entire house cost him $28, 12.5 cents, which is would have been about 3 months' wages for some people in 1845. Average house at the time in Concord was around $500. So as Thoreau says, his house was not only the cheapest, it was also the best built. So here's the Beanfield. He talks about how he moved into this house, started building his house in March of 1845. He moved in on July 4th, 1845. But by then he had gotten most of the house done, but his main thing that first summer was the Beanfield. He said, I did not read books my first summer, I hoed beans. But the farmers on Walden Street and what is now Route 2 would go by and they see this guy by himself with his hoe hoeing beans. And they're kind of making fun of him. They're like,
but it got started really late because it took him, he waited a while before he broke down.
So they're like, you know, you're too late for planting beans. They're never going to amount to anything. But he estimates that if he had taken all of his bean plants and laid them end to end, he would have had 7.5 miles of beans.
Wow.
So he got a lot of beans that first summer, most of which he sold.
He grew a few other things too.
He planted beets, potatoes, Indian corn, peas. You'll notice a lot of underground. He said the corn didn't really do very well. The second season he planted tomatoes. He said they didn't really do anything either. The potatoes
Those
did well.
Those are both very fertilizer loving. Very.
The peas did well. The potatoes did well.
Another
the beets did well. The beans did well. Why is he out here growing these beans? I think what he's trying to do. So he's at Walden Pond because he wants to live a life of self-sufficiency and say, look, you know, for very little money, you can live a pretty good life. He's not growing the beans for eating them. I think he's growing the beans to kind of prove a point.
He did sell them, and he does talk about the profit.
But some of it was he says, I did better than most farmers in Concord that year.
Which for beans was probably, he also had a much larger bean crop than almost anyone would have. But it was also partly, this was a great period, and especially in Concord was starting to have, in the 1820s, they were starting to have all of these agricultural fairs and societies. There was all this idea of sort of agriculture and progress, and he wanted to show that you could be successful in a more, in a more human scale, simplistic way.
So he lives here. While he's living at Walden, he writes his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. He writes an article, an essay about Thomas Carlyle. He writes an essay about going to the Maine woods. The second summer he was here, he starts a lecture called A History of Myself, which eventually became the first chapter of Walden. He's getting a lot done in terms of writing. This is going to be a writer's retreat. That's exactly what it was. And he got a lot done in terms of writing. His friend Ellery Channing called it his wooden inkstand in the woods, and that's exactly what it was. So he leaves here on September 6, 1847, just 2 days ago, 2 days ago, was the anniversary. What are we going to do with his house? Well, technically it's Emerson's house because it's on Emerson's land. Thoreau's not particularly attached to the house. And have you all seen the replica of the house over? Okay, so you know what we're talking about. So what are you going to do with it? Well, Emerson's gardener, Hugh Whelan, W-H-E-L-A-N, he has a family, and he's looking for some land of his own. And Emerson says, well, great, why don't you take Henry's house, come back to the Beanfield, you can live here. And Hugh says, great. So he dug a cellar, and he moved the house up here. He had a board or he had a beam going across the hole.
I actually wonder if these are some of the beams.
Could have been.
Yeah.
But the front of the house was here. The back of the house was on one of the beams. The cellar was much bigger. Hugh supposedly was going to expand the house for his family. Hugh after moving the house up here, abandoned his family and went west.
Oh, great, good.
And we've lost touch with whatever happened to him. Eventually the beam broke and the house was actually kind of half in, half out of the hole.
No.
Yep. Emerson then sold. Emerson's like, got to get rid of this house.
I know.
Meanwhile, Thoreau doesn't really mention it at all. Oh, and Emerson was in England at the time. And so the house was sold to a farmer named Clark who lived over by the Esterbrook Woods. He moved the house way over to the Esterbrook Woods where Little Esterbrook Road is now, the one where everybody's fighting about the property rights and stuff. Over there was the Clark farm. The house sat there. Farmer Clark took parts of the house, used it to repair his barn. He then used the house for a pigsty. He used the house for a corn crib, and eventually it just fell apart. So in 1863 or 64, a couple years after Thoreau died, his sister Sophia walked over there and she sat in what the remains of the house and had lunch and talks about being there, eating
But then it had no
lunch.
roof,
Right, by then the roof was mostly gone. Yeah, so anyway, so the house eventually just fell apart or was used in parts of barns and stuff. So later in the 1890s, some people supposedly had pieces of the true house, which are in the Walden Woods Project has some. Thoreau Society has a couple of pieces. The Concord Museum has some pieces. Nobody knew where the house was exactly because they filled in the cellar until 1945 when a local archaeologist named Roland Robbins dug. And he found the cellar, and he found pieces of glass and nails and plaster and bricks and stuff like that. Yep, down where the house is, yeah. So for about 100 years after Thoreau was here, nobody knew exactly where it was. Thoreau doesn't really talk about it that much. He talks about, a couple years later, he says, sometimes I wonder why I ever left, but that's really the only time where he gets kind of sentimental about it. I think these were probably two of the happiest years of his life because he's doing his thing and he's writing and he's more or less on his own and he's got the good wishes of his friends and neighbors. It became quite the thing to come out to the woods and see this guy living in the woods. And Thoreau loved that. He loved telling people why he welcomed all honest pilgrims, as he says in Walden, and he liked having these people come out and, you're a Harvard graduate and you're doing what? What? Why are you living in the woods? And Henry would tell them, well, I came to the woods to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life.
Gee, that sounds like the 1960s to me.